Okay, so part 2 on Gebrokts. Baruch Hashem, last week's class got a lot of feedback, both from the YouTube and the podcast versions of them. So it seems to have gotten quite some publicity. And most importantly, I had mentioned the food called chremslin. And I said that I don't know what it is. And I exposed myself for the ignoramus that I am, because chremslin is a very famous Pesach dish, and it's some sort of latkes or pancake made out of, nowadays would be often made out of potatoes, but obviously originally it was made out of matzah meal, and probably till today many people make it with matzah meal, so that's how it came into the Gebrokts discussion. So anyway, let's just get that out of the way. Now, like I mentioned last time, today we're going to look at the tshuva of the Alter Rebbe, which discusses and explains the chumra of Gebrokts. Now, this is a very important tshuva for a couple of reasons. First of all, somebody asked me, how do you define a chumra on Pesach? Some people don't eat fish because in the town where their ancestors came from, the fish were processed in a way that there was chametz mixed into it. And another person doesn't eat chicken, and another person doesn't eat cucumber, because back in the day in Russia, they didn't have, So how do you define a chumra? How do you define a mishagas? And how do you find something that's maybe a little bit mishagas, but, it's my family tradition, but it's not there to be sort of necessarily, we're not here to preach the gospel to influence others to do it. So the Alter Rebbe in this tshuva we see presents the whole Gebrokts thing as a halachic matter. And even though, as you'll see, it's quite a far-fetched chumra, but it's a chumra which is strongly anchored in halachic framework, let's say. So that does set the chumra of Gebrokts apart from possibly other chumras. In addition, as we mentioned last week, this is a chumra which has basically become more or less a Hasidic chumra, in the sense that it was instituted by the Magid or by the Talmidei HaMagid. Now, it's true that there were variations of the chumra of Gebrokts much earlier than that, but that also was related to the whole history of the development of matzah. So there's different iterations of the chumra of Gebrokts, but the chumra of Gebrokts, as we know it, initiates in the school of the Magid, the teacher of the Alter Rebbe, and so everybody knows that, and all Hasidim do that, but they don't. The Alter Rebbe is the first and the primary written source about it. Everybody else has that from tradition, and interestingly, in some of their traditions, there is almost an emphasis on the fact that it does not make sense halachically. So Eliyahu Kitov in the Sefer HaToda'ah, in English I think it's called the Book of Our Heritage, we have it in the library, he brings a couple of stories in this regard. One of them will say over here brought from the Kotzker Rebbe, that he said to the Alexander Rebbe that he should go and learn very, very carefully the halachas of matzah and figure out if it's mutter to eat gebrokts. And he came back and reported that he cannot find any basis whatsoever to be machmir on gebrokts. And so the Kotzker Rebbe said to him, so it must be that the reason for the chumra is only al pisoid, according to Kabbalistical and mystical reasons, and that would be even more reason to be strict about gebrokts, because we take those things very seriously. So, whereas in other schools of Chassidim there's a tradition that Gebrokts specifically doesn't have any halachic basis, and it's kind of this mystical holy thing that we do, in the Alter Rebbe, which is again the first published work on the chumra of Gebrokts, very much does emphasize the halachic aspect of the chumra. Okay, now I have created a shtickle, a source sheet for today, but unfortunately it's only in Hebrew, so for those who would find an all-Hebrew worksheet, source sheet of any use, here you have it. If not, you'll follow along. Hopefully it will all be clear. Sorry. So we'll just mention, obviously, what we started, to recap a few things that we said last week. Most importantly, the aspect that we touched upon last week, that's going to be very relevant today, is the machloikus, let's call it, between the Rambam and Rabbeinu Yerucham. And that question was, are you allowed to use roasted flour on Pesach? Meaning, before you get into matzah meal, are you allowed to take flour, roast the flour, and use that flour to do your cooking and baking for Pesach? So, we ended up having a machlokes where the Rambam says that it is allowed, and he understood the Gemara that says that it's not allowed to be speaking specifically of where you roasted whole kernels of wheat, and then after it was roasted, you ground it into flour, and that's when we have a concern that perhaps it's not going to be roasted properly. Whereas Rabbeinu Yerucham and those that follow his school said, no, even if you roast flour as is in the oven, we're still concerned that you are going to that it's not going to be roasted properly, and therefore it might become chametz. Now, just to clarify that, everybody all agree, this is explicit in the Gemara, that in theory, roasted flour cannot become chametz. The machlokes here is about whether we can actually determine and be confident in our determination that current flour is actually fully roasted. In other words, the Rambam says, look, you roast it, if you're confident that it's fully roasted, you're good. Rabbeinu Yerucham and his school will say, no, there's always a concern that maybe it's not properly roasted. Now, I think it's important to see this shitta explained inside in the words of the poskim who bring it. For a number of reasons, I think it's important to see it inside. Some of them will become apparent during the class today, but let's go. So I'm going to read to you from the Haggadah Rabbeinu Peretz, a little bit of biography over here. There is a sefer called Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol, which is the Smag. He's known as the Smag, the Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. He wrote a book of all the 613 mitzvahs. Now, came along Reb Yitzchak Mekerbil, the Ri Mekerbil, who those of you who come to the Gemara class, we mentioned the Ri Mekerbil recently in a Tosfos. He's a student of Rabbi Chil of Paris. His dates are 1210 to 1280. And he said, look, this book of all the 613 mitzvahs is too long. We've got to make a shortened version, which he did not name it this way, but it later became known as the Smak, as opposed to the Smag, which is the big Sefer Mitzvahs. This was the Smak, the small Sefer Mitzvahs. And the small one, or the short one, included only mitzvahs which are relevant nowadays. This Sefer very quickly became a staple in his generation as a very important work of halacha, and many different people wrote Haggoyis notes on them, and most prominently Rabbeinu Peretz, who's a little bit younger than the Ri Mekerbil. He dies in the year 1300, so he dies 20 years later than him. I'm not sure what his birth year is. And Haggadah Rabbeinu Peretz become sort of part and parcel of the actual work on the Smak. So, in Haggadah Rabbeinu Peretz, the Smak, number Mitzvah Reish Chaf Beis. So, if those of you who are following in the source sheet, this is the first source on the source sheet. Let's see inside what he says. It is customary, people have the custom, lefes kemach soiles betano, to bake flour in the oven, for the children, to make dishes. You need to make, let's say, your kids can't eat matzah, your baby can't eat matzah, they could eat porridge. So how are you going to give your kid porridge on Pesach? You're going to roast flour in the oven, and then you could feed it to your kids mixed with water or whatever, and you have porridge, right? Very good. Lasis mimenu papa balaz. I don't know what that word means, but whatever dish they were making. People who do this rely on the Gemara, which we already saw this Gemara last week, in Daf Lamed Tes and Pesachim, that baked flour, it's a mission in actuality, that baked flour cannot become chametz. Mio kasha, however, it's difficult to rely on this, because he brings the Gemara that there's a concern that perhaps it's not going to be cooked, it's not going to be properly roasted, properly cooked. And look what he says. Lefisha, I'm skipping a few lines, but again, if you're following inside, it would be helpful. Lefisha, you cannot determine that. How could you notice if flour is properly baked? This time the Gemara says that something baked cannot become chametz. That's talking specifically about bread or matzah. There's a very easy way to tell if it's properly baked. You break it open and you can see, are the sort of strings of dough still stringy, or is it properly baked? So you have an objective barometer to determine if it's properly baked. Whereas just putting flour in the oven, you don't know if it's properly baked, and therefore you have to forbid this. Now, so no baking flour for your kids. Some say no, we can be lenient about baking flour. So then he brings the Rambam, who says that we're only concerned if you're baking kernels and then grinding it into flour, that you might not bake it properly. But if you're actually baking flour, so then it would be fine. But the Rabbeinu Peretz, he does not accept this leniency of the Rambam. As we said, he's part of this whole school of Rabbi Yerucham that reject that Rambam. And then he says like this. And again, he reiterates, we're rejecting this because there's nobody who can actually determine if flour is properly baked. Now, then he goes on to say, there's possibly another solution. Now, there's another din in Hilchos Chametz. I mentioned it in passing last week. I didn't sort of spell it out, so I'll spell it out now. And again, this is going to be relevant. The cholot shechaloti bereishchin. That means the Mishnah says, the Gemara says, you're allowed to take flour, raw flour, and throw it into boiling hot water that's already on a steady boil, and cook it in that way. And thereby we're certain that it's going to be properly cooked before it becomes chametz. So according to the Gemara, that would be a legitimate way of preparing food on Pesach. Not like you might usually do that. Let's say you make your knaidlech, put it into water, and then you heat up the water. No, you make sure the water is on a full rolling boil before you start the cooking, and then you throw the raw knaidl into the boil, and it still maintains a strong boil. And we're not talking about matzah, we're talking about making flour, actual flour, that would become chametz. The Gemara says that's permissible because if it's already boiling hot water, it's going to become cooked before it has a chance to become chametz. Okay. However, we don't do this. Already in the times of the Goinim, that's known as the period immediately post of the Talmud, they forbade this. This is too risky business. We don't know if it's actually going to be boiling enough. It's going to maintain the boil enough. This is dangerous territory. We don't go there. Now, so in other words, me'ikar hadin, strictly speaking, there's this concept of putting things in boiling hot water, and it should be fine. In practice, we refrain from it. So now, Rabbeinu Peretz says, I have a solution for your children who cannot eat anything, and you're trying to make them a porridge on Pesach. What was the solution we're discussing? Roasting your flour. Yeah? What do we say? No, you cannot roast the flour. Reuven, yeah, you cannot roast the flour. Why not?
Because you can't be sure that every single...
So what if I combine two things? I roast the flour, and then I don't just stamazoi cook it. I cook it in boiling water. So even though the Goinim said we shouldn't rely on that, but here you're having two things together. It's already roasted. Maybe there's a tiny concern that it's not properly roasted, so to cover that, you'll put it in boiling hot water. Says Rabbeinu Peretz, still not good enough. Because maybe it's not going to be the milk. He's describing porridge here. He's describing roasted flour with milk. The milk is not going to be properly boiling when you throw it in. That's how it cools it down, the boiling a bit. So it's not going to be good enough, and you won't notice that it's not properly boiling. So no, that's still not good enough. Then he says another thing.
The milk that you put afterwards.
Yes. In other words, you're trying to make porridge for your kids. So take flour, roast it, put the milk. Should already be on a steady boil before you put the flour into it, and put the flour into the milk, and then you're covered from any side, because first of all the flour is roasted, and even if maybe there's a piece of flour that's not fully roasted, you put it in chaluta bereishchin, that it's already
boiling.
It's already boiling. Now,
but why is his issue with that?
Because he says no. The Ma'aseh the Goinim said we're not relying on us to be proficient in boiling the water properly, or the milk properly.
The milk this time.
The milk, right? Okay. Now there's another issue here. Milk. Listen to this. In general, the only thing that could make something chametz is flour mixed with water. Flour mixed with milk doesn't become chametz. Remember we spoke about egg in the Gemara class. We spoke about egg matzah. Yeah, doesn't become. Now, if it's flour mixed with milk or some other liquid and water, then it can become chametz. But if it's pure milk without a drop of water, it would be fine. Says Rabbeinu Peretz, I have a better idea. Let's take the roasted flour and get milk which is certified that you've ensured that it's absolutely 100% milk with no water mixed in. And then what's the problem? Says Rabbeinu Peretz, no, you can never be certain that there isn't a tiny drop of water mixed into the milk. Okay? Now, why is it so important to see this inside? Because here, we're going to see again how far-fetched the chumra of Gebrokts is, which the Alter Rebbe is pushing for. But here you see, this is not some Hasidic Torah, this is one of the foremost poskim of Ashkenazi Jewry, who's taking, this is so far-fetched. You have flour that's 100% roasted, and you combine with that milk that has no water, that you've certified no water, and you make the milk 100% boiling, and still Rabbeinu Peretz is insisting, and this is not for adults, this is for kids. It's for kids who are struggling to eat. And yet Rabbeinu Peretz is still insisting that the severity of chametz is so strong that we must avoid this. And I think that, this Rabbeinu Peretz, I wanted to set the stage of today's class with this Rabbeinu Peretz, because it kind of gives you some precedent to the extremity, if that's the word, with which we take the chumra of chametz. Yes, Ari.
Oh, the word you just used, I was about to say, there's precedent to being far-fetched.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Okay, now the next source we move on to is...
Pedantic is the word.
What?
Pedantic.
Pedantic, okay. Wow. The next source we move on to is the... Akiva, for those who would like, there is a source sheet. Then... The next source we move on to is the Trumas Hadeshen. Who is the Trumas Hadeshen? The Trumas Hadeshen is Rabbi Yisrael Iselin, who is, his dates are 1390 to 1460, also very prominent Ashkenazi Pesach. It's usually said that his Teshuvah work was questions that he himself composed the questions in order to give the answer. They weren't necessarily questions that he actually received. And he asks the following question. What happens if a person's making... matzah on Pesach? In those days it was customary for people to make matzahs on Pesach, and by mistake he put in too much water. So the ratio, he has too much water to ratio to the flour in the dough. Are you allowed to add flour into the dough? And he says, no, you shouldn't do that. Why? Because if you add flour into the dough, there's a concern that maybe that flour is not going to get properly mixed into the dough, and therefore you're going to end up with flour inside your matzah, with flour that's not part of a dough. And therefore, what should you do? Rather, you should, if you need to have, in order for this to work, you would have to have another person to help you. So you have somebody else need another dough, which has more water to flour ratio. So you end up with two doughs, one with too much flour, one with too much water. And once they're both in dough form, then you can mix them together into one dough, and the ratio of the flour and the water balances each other out, and that way you circumvent any concern that there will be any pieces of flour that are not mixed into the dough. This Trumas Hadeshen is brought lahalacha in all the paskim, in Shantur, Shulchan Aruch, etc. We paskin like this Trumas Hadeshen. There's also discussion in the Magen Avraham and in the Alter Rebbe and others what to do b'diavad, meaning what happens if you did this and you added flour in because you didn't have somebody else to help you, whatever it is, are you allowed to eat that matzah on Pesach? That's a discussion. Perhaps we'll see, time permitting, if it's necessary to get into that in the rest of today's class. Okay, so now we have all our introductions. We could go into the meat of today's class, and the outline is like this. We're going to read a tshuva from the Maharashtam. We're going to read a Pri Chodosh who disagrees with the Maharashtam, and then we're going to read the tshuva of the Alter Rebbe, which is based on the said Maharashtam and Pri Chodosh. So, who's the Maharashtam? The Maharashtam his name is Reb Shmuel de Medina, usually known by his acronym of Maharashtam. His dates are 1506 to 1589, and he was a great posek in Greece, in Saloniki, Greece, and he wrote this Truvas. So he starts off by talking about, and again, for those who are following along, this is in your source sheet, Hayufkas. There's this food item called Yufkas, which is made in the following way. You take a measure of flour, and half of the measure of flour you knead with water, and the other half of the measure remains on the side. And the woman who is shaping it with her hands, and then she cuts it up into the size of small cakes, small balls, and she gives it to the tugrima, to the Turkish, in other words, to the maid. She gives it to the maid to knead it with, let's translate eitz parer as, I guess, a rolling stick of sorts, on a board that's next to her. And from the flour that's left, remember originally she only used half the flour for the recipe of the dough, so what do you do with the other flour? From the rest of the flour, every time that she sort of flips and rolls the dough, she puts more flour to coat it, more and more flour as she keeps on rolling it out. In front of her there is a piece of metal that's very hot. Al ha'achach means a fire, an oven, which is heated up. And then she puts this dough on top of the hot metal, and instantly right away it becomes basically baked, and she removes it from the oven. So this Yufkas bread, the Maharashtam, the person who wrote to the Maharashtam, is saying it would appear that it's forbidden to make this Yufkas bread on Pesach, because you have all this raw flour that's that you're rolling it into, and it seems pretty clear that flour is not going to be baked properly. Now we just saw, again, the person, what's the word, interlocutor, is that the word? The person interlocutor of the Trumas Hadeshen of the Marashtam is saying, look, you remember this Trumas Hadeshen which we just saw? He says that you're not allowed to add flour into the dough afterwards. So certainly here, where your mom is adding flour the whole time, certainly it would be appropriate to not allow this yufkas bread. And but we're asking you, Marashtam, to tell us what our teacher, our master, the Marashtam. You should tell us what to do, and we will not move not to the right or to the left. Now, what exactly is yufkas bread? Obviously, we've read his description, but let me read you from Wikipedia. It says like this: Yufka bread is a Turkish name of a very thin, large, unleavened flat bread in Turkish cuisine, also named under different names in Arab cuisine, baked on a convex metal griddle called a saj in Arabic and a sak in Turkish. Then you have lavash bread. Lavash is similar to yufka, but in Turkish cuisine, lavash is prepared with a yeast dough, while yufka is typically unleavened. Okay? Now, if you search lavash bread or yufka bread, you will see many videos of how it's made. But there's one video, which I mentioned him last week, my friend Rabbi Shraga Hamnik, he came across this video of some tribe, which although they have a YouTube channel, they're kind of living an ancient style life, and you're going to see how they make this yufka bread back, or this lavash bread back. This is in some tribe today, but this is, and it matches pretty much exactly with the process that the Marashtam is describing. It's a 20 or so minute video. I'm going to show you 2 minutes of it where you get to see the main thing. And for those listening on YouTube or on the podcast, I will put the link to this video in the description of the episode so that you can also watch it. Okay, so that was the question posed to the Marashtam. Says the Marashtam concerning the yufkas, and again, if you have the source sheet, you can follow inside. So he says, the truth is, you're right. It appears to me, as you said, that shomer nafshe yirchik mehem is something that should best be avoided by anybody who cares for their nefesh. For many reasons. First of all, what you said for the Trumas Hadeshen, that there's concern that flour won't be mixed in properly into the dough, and then in general, you have the concern of kimchida vishuna, which is that we can't tell if the roasted flour is actually fully roasted. However, but it would appear to me, and you could tell from the response in the tshuva here, that he wasn't just addressing a technical question, he was also addressing some conflict within the community. You'll see soon how that becomes clear. So he says, however, those who have been using this yufka bread on Pesach been doing so already for a lot of time, so you don't need to reprimand, because certainly they have what to rely on, namely the Rambam. Because the Rambam, we all know, what does the Rambam say? The Rambam says you are allowed to eat roasted flour on Pesach. And so those who have the tradition of eating yufkas bread on Pesach, they're relying on the Rambam that roasted flour is no problem. So here you see the flour goes onto the hot thing, it gets roasted, no problem whatsoever. And in fact, I've already heard and seen that from Bursa and on, Bursa is a city in northwestern Turkey, so from Bursa and further, that community, they have the tradition to rely on the Rambam with everything. And also, I heard that in Arabistan, I had a problem understanding this word, but it's Arabistan, so I'm not sure exactly what city that refers to, but basically that in that region, everybody eats the yufkas bread on Pesach, and nobody has any qualms about it, they're all relying on the Rambam. Now, he says, even for those who disagree with the Rambam, who say that you cannot eat roasted flour on Pesach, Reuven, you with us? Even those who say that you cannot eat roasted flour on Pesach, it could be that that's only if you put a lot of flour into a pot to roast. So there you cannot ascertain that all the flour is properly roasted. But here, where you're spreading out the flour and it's very sort of thin layer, so it's going to be roasted very quickly. Maybe even those Rabbi Yerucham, etc., they would agree, Rabbi Peretz, perhaps they would even agree that it's permissible. You're saying that if you take this yufkas bread and you take the flour off the surface and you mix it with water, it becomes into a doughy substance. So that would seem to prove that the flour on the surface of the yufkas bread is not properly roasted. Yeah? No, I still maintain that yes, it's best to avoid it. Yufkas bread, if you ask me what I think about yufkas bread, avoid it on Pesach. But I don't think you need to make a campaign against those who have the tradition to allow yufkas bread on Pesach. And then he goes on to say that those who make flour out of ground matzah, that's for sure permissible, and we do so. So here he says explicitly that Gebrokts is no problem, and it's a little bit funny or ironic because in the end you're going to see the Alter Rebbe's chumra is based on the Maharshtam, but the Maharshtam himself says that Gebrokts is fine. But as you'll see, he's saying Gebrokts is fine because he's not talking about the same matzah that the Alter Rebbe is talking about. By the time of the Alter Rebbe, the matzah had developed into the way we have it today, the thin cracker matzah, and the Alter Rebbe is maintaining that it's specifically in that type of matzah that there's a legitimate concern with Gebrokts. Whereas the type of matzah that the Maharshtam was using, which was much softer, etc., there was no concern of Gebrokts. So it's just ironic that it comes out that our chumra of Gebrokts is based on the Maharshtam, even though the Maharshtam himself ate Gebrokts. But anyway. Then he goes on to say that it's totally fine for there to be conflicting customs within one city. One community within a city following one custom and another community following another custom, and so you could see that he's talking here to the sensitive politics or dynamics of the community. And then he says, if you'll listen to my advice, let go of your campaign against the yufkas bread and put your knife away. And basically, anybody who listens to you without machlokes is good. And if not, just keep the peace and don't compromise on the peace between the communities because of your yufkas bread campaign. Because we can rely on the Rambam. Is this necessary to understand, or is it?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Go on.
The question I have is, why is yufkas bread? Why is there a need or a desire to use that as opposed to?
That was their living style. I don't know. You could ask the same question. Why do you want to have knaidlech? People like to have knaidlech, so they like to have yufkas bread. Okay. Now we move on to the Pri Chodosh, right? So we've started with Pri Chodosh. Here's Reb Cheskia Disalua. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. He was a Pesach. He's already a century later than the Maharshtam. His dates are 1656 to 1695, and his known as a very strong-minded Pesach. His Pri Chodosh is written on the Seder of the Shulchan Aruch, and Akiva actually mentioned last week part of what he's going to say here today. So he starts off again with the very same word, hayufkas bread. Those who are following on the source sheet, it's right there. The yufkas that is made, anyway, he copies and pastes the whole description of how it's made. Says the Pri Chodosh, I know of no reason to forbid them. I can't think of any possible reason to forbid the yufkas bread on Pesach. If you're going to quote to me that which the Trumas Hadeshan says, that you're not allowed to add flour into the dough if you put too much water in the recipe, that you're not allowed to add flour, says the Pri Chodosh, no. Over there, the problem is that the flour goes inside the dough. So when you're baking a matzah in the oven and within, sort of inside the matzah, there might be some raw flour, then there's a concern that it might not be baked properly. But here, any flour is all on the surface that gets direct heat impact onto this hot oven metal type of thing. And so there's no concern that there's anything going to be left open there. We have the general concern of kimchid avishuna, which is, like we described with Rabbi Parrot and others, that we're never going to allow you to have roasted flour because maybe it's not fully roasted. Says the Pri Chodosh, no, that's no problem at all. Because he goes on to quote all the sources, and then he says that over here you're only talking about a little bit of flour. You're not talking about a whole big pot of flour. A little bit of flour over there, everybody would agree that it's permissible. The Pri Chodosh says, I'm explicitly disagreeing with the Maharshtam, who said that best avoid the yufkas bread. Says the Pri Chodosh, no. Everybody agrees, even Rabbeinu Yeruchman and Rabbeinu Peretz. And you saw how extreme Rabbeinu Peretz went, that even if it's roasted and even in milk without water and even no, you can't do it. Says the Pri Chodosh, even he would agree that if it's just a little bit of flour on the surface of the matzah, we can be confident that it is fully roasted. And then he goes on to say that Maharshtam himself allowed to use the Gebrokts, and he's describing making sufganim, which today we use sufganim to mean donuts, but basically to make something out of ground matzah meal. And then he goes on to quote some other source that says that you shouldn't do this, and here he gets very upset. He says, what's the reason not to do this? So he says, there was once a story And the story is that the one time there was the wife of a learned person who was doing so, and her neighbor thought that, remember we discussed this last week, that the possible reason suggested for Gebrokts was that people are going to think that the flour is not, that it's not matzah meal, that it's regular flour. So this is in fact what happened. There was this ignoramus neighbor of hers who thought she was using regular flour, and the next day she took flour and she fried her fish. She made sort of a fish schnitzel with using regular flour, and therefore says the Knesset Agdoila, which the Pri Chadash is quoting over here, that you should forbid this. Says the Pri Chadash, and this is what Akiva said last week, we do not make new gezeros. We're not here to any gezeros, any decrees that Chazal put in place because they're concerned that if you allow this, then the following mistake might come out of that. We have to keep, but we don't make, because one time there was some woman who thought that she saw somebody using matzah meal and she thought that that meant you're allowed to use flour. We don't need to stop our. We don't need to refrain from eating what we want to eat because of some. We don't make any new gezeros. Anyway, he goes on, and then. But this is very important. He finishes off by reiterating that in general, when it comes to the whole machlokes between the Rambam and Rabbi Neruchim and those about whether or not you're allowed to use roasted flour, he says absolutely we follow the Rambam. We follow the strict opinion. It's the majority opinion. In other words, he's presenting it as if the Rambam is a one-off opinion, but that the vast majority of poskim are strict. Now you're not allowed to use roasted flour on Pesach. This is a biblical prohibition. Certainly we are machmir not to use roasted flour on Pesach. It's just that he's saying when it comes to the yufkas bread, when it's just a little bit of flour on the surface, there everyone would agree that that is fine, because a little bit of flour you can be guaranteed that it is fully roasted. And so we're going to now be in a position to read the tshuva of the Alter Rebbe and understand it properly. And here we go. And Ruven will see you on the recording in Mitzvah Hashem. Okay. So this tshuva of the Alter Rebbe is usually labeled as Siman Vav, chapter 6 of the Alter Rebbe's responsa. And there are in the library, in the Chabad library, there are two manuscripts. I looked them up online, and I actually produced here a picture. I'm going to show it to you. Here, you know what? You can pass this around. We're going to look at something from this picture soon, but pass it around. This is a picture. This is a screenshot from the library of the Chabad website. This is there's two. There's manuscript number 1017 and manuscript number 1027. This is I'm pretty sure this is from 1027. It is not the Alter Rebbe's handwriting. It's the handwriting of a copyist. But this is the tshuva of the Alter Rebbe. Okay.
Did they use cursive writing back in the day? Cursive Hebrew writing?
It's, I don't know if cursive is the right term, but it's not. It's
not the block, it's the script.
Those of you who came to the Gemara class can look on the WhatsApp group. I posted a link a few weeks ago to a tablet of all different fonts of ancient Hebrew writing.
Awesome.
Yep. Okay. Says the Alter Rebbe like this. Gelile Yodav HaTahiros, it's a flowery way of writing. By the way, it's interesting, in the printed version of the tshuva, there's no title. It just says chapter 6 and it starts the tshuva. But in the manuscript, you can see at the very top of the manuscript, it says, Nidoin Bishul Matzah Shenispara, the issue of cooking matzah meal. Right? So, that's what he's calling it, cooking matzah meal. Broken, we mentioned last week, the word broken means to break up, to make crumbs, so that's the title of the tshuva. I'm not sure why in the printed version they omitted the title. That title appears in both of the manuscripts of this tshuva. Anyway, Glile Yodav HaTohiros, your letter, Vaskala Shabari, Yisuf Karisi, I read entirely. Ovasi B'Ktarah, and I have come here briefly, Leimer in Sefer, to say, this Isu Bishul Matzah Shenisbara, regarding the prohibition of cooking matzah meal. Be'emes, Kigam She'ini Isu Gamu or Bar Medina. I acknowledge, says the Alter Rebbe, that it's not an absolute, clear-cut halachic prohibition. Nevertheless, hamachmir tavi al bracha. If you are strict concerning cooking matzah meal, it is praiseworthy. It is not a ridiculous thing. It is not a chumra without any reason. Rather, there is a very good reason for this chumra. To to be careful about a concern for a biblical prohibition. According to the opinion of the smak, which means it's not really the smak himself, it's the hagoyis of the smak. That's Rabbeinu Bereth. And Rabbeinu Yerucham, huva beis Yosef siman tov samachalef, which beis Yosef quotes, v'chein pasuk ha-pri chodosh. And that's what the Pri Chodosh paskins. Remember the last line of the Pri Chodosh. We paskin like the strict opinion, the majority opinion, that roasted flour is forbidden. And again, I'm going to emphasize that nobody holds that roasted flour can actually become chametz. It's all a concern that maybe it's not fully roasted. Okay. Our eyes observe baharbi matzahs and many matzahs that even after you finish baking the matzah, there is some remnant flour left on the surface. The reason why we still have flour on the surface of our matzah, says the Alter Rebbe, is because first of all, it is a very hard dough, meaning in the recipe of the matzah, the ratio is a lot of flour to a little bit of water, so it makes it a very stiff consistency, and it hasn't been kneaded properly, and so you're going to remain with some little bit of flour left on the surface. This that the Taz says in the end of Siman Tov Nun Tes that b'diavad it's permissible. What's the Taz talking about over there? He's saying, remember we had our case of the Trumas Hadeshen where you're adding in flour later, and the Trumas Hadeshen said you're not allowed to do that. What if you did do that? What if you did add flour in? Are you allowed to eat that matzah? Says the Taz, yes you are. So in other words, b'diavad it's okay. Says the Alter Rebbe, no. The Taz only means that you're allowed to eat the matzah plain. If somebody made matzah, the type of matzah that the Trumas Hadeshen tells you not to make, right? You're making your matzah, there's too much water, you added flour, which the Trumas Hadeshen told you not to do, but you did it anyway. Are you allowed to eat that matzah? So the answer is yes, but you're allowed to eat it, but you're not allowed to make it wet. You're not allowed to put it into your soup. So b'meila, and even though the reason why the Magen Avraham says you're not allowed to put it into your soup is because he says there's flour inside the matzah, and so that flour that's inside the matzah doesn't have direct contact with the source of heat in the oven, right? Because the matzah itself divides, and blocks the heat of the oven from reaching the flour that's inside the matzah. Here in our case that we're talking about right now, that's not a problem, because the matzah, the flour that we're concerned about is not inside the matzah, it's on the surface of the matzah. And so the Magen Avraham would allow you to put it in the soup b'diavad. That's all according to the opinion of the Rashi and the Rambam, which in that stage in his argument, the Magen Avraham is suggesting that we could rely on the Rashi and the Rambam who allow roasted flour. Remember, the Pri Chodosh said absolutely not. We cannot rely on the Rambam. We have to pass on the chumra that you're not allowed roasted flour. Rabbeinu Yerucham, the Pri Chodosh himself says that it's okay because it's only a little bit of flour. And the Pri Chodosh disagrees with the Rashdam, where the Rashdam said there's no difference between a little bit of flour and a lot of flour, but the Pri Chodosh says no, with a little bit of flour we can be lenient. He says, okay, but go back to the Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham says that it would be a problem. The only reason why, if it's a little bit of flour, the only reason why it's not a problem is because the only reason why the Magen Avraham holds one second. Pshita shamach b'kashtam tavel of bracha. The Hagam Magen Avraham l'sfir le'chiluk zeh the le'in l'stap b'kala b'diavad. Right. The Magen Avraham only has a suffix whether you're allowed b'diavad to eat this matzah. But the Chatchila he agreed that you're not allowed to make this matzah even though it's only a little bit of flour. A little bit of flour is okay. No, that was the Pri Chodosh. The Magen Avraham says no. So what comes out over here is, I'm going to skip in the next line in the Alter Rebbe, because I think it's a little bit complex and it's not really relevant to understanding what we're going on here. What comes out this very interesting thing. Let's read the last line of this paragraph. Even though both the Magen Avraham and the Pri Chodosh would hold that it's not a problem, what's the Alter Rebbe saying? We're presented here with matzah. matzah that has flour on the surface. Is that flour a problem if you're going to dip it into your soup or make it into knaidlech? So, we're not just here to make up problems on our own. We're here to follow the paskin. So let's ask the paskin. We ask the Magen Avraham, he's going to say it's no problem. We ask the Brei Chadash, he's also going to say it's no problem. You ask the Mashtam, he's for sure going to say it's no problem. He even allowed the yufka spread. But here we're not even talking about yufka spread. We're talking about matzah the way we know it. But there's a concern that there's a little bit of flour on the surface. So Mashtam for sure allows it. I'm sorry. No, take that back. Mashtam is going to be our reason to be machmir. Brei Chadash for sure allows it. Magen Avraham for sure allows it. So why should it be a problem? So we'll get to Mashtam in a second. But the Alter Rebbe is saying another point. The Brei Chadash and the Magen Avraham are allowing it for two different reasons. The Magen Avraham is allowing it because it's on the surface of the matzah and not inside the matzah. So he holds that that's not a problem. The Brei Chadash allows it because it's only a little bit of matzah, of flour, not a lot of flour. But you always have but both of them would hold that the other reason is not a good reason. In other words, if you say the Magen Avraham, can I have only a little bit of flour that's roasted? He's going to say no. You ask the Brei Chadash, can you have roasted flour if it would be a lot of flour on the surface? He would say no, right? So, b'meila, because it's not the same reason, therefore you cannot combine to make that into a leniency. Now, this is very interesting because essentially, what both the Magen Avraham and the Brei Chadash are claiming, they're both claiming that in this case we can be certain that the flour is properly roasted, right? Okay, they're saying it a little bit different. The Brei Chadash says that because it's a little bit, and the Magen Avraham says because it's mamish direct, on the surface of the matzah. So perhaps you could say that that's kind of the same reason. But the Alter Rebbe is saying, no, this is two different reasons, and because it's two different reasons, we cannot combine them to be a united voice in leniency.
You don't need to
Now,
combine them.
what?
You don't need to combine them. You need either or. You don't need any combination. Where is he talking about it?
No, because each one of them would disagree with the other one's leniency.
But right now I have two reasons to be makel.
But you don't have two poskim who agree to both of those reasons, to either of those reasons. But each reason that exactly, this is the point that the Rebbe is making. The Alter Rebbe is making, in order for this to be the basis to be lenient, you would need to have one reason that is muskim on both the Magen Avraham and the Brei Chadash.
Does he say that generally when it comes to snifim and halacha?
That is way beyond. If you want to see there is a sefer from Rabbi Farkash who goes through Klalei HaPoskim HaHira based on the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. That's beyond the scope. I'm pointing out here what the Alter Rebbe is saying. I'm not going to discuss now how and to what extent we will carry that over into other areas in halacha. I just want to point out that I struggle a bit with understanding. 1 second. I want to emphasize questions that are enhance the flow of the class. Please ask them. Questions that are just further discussion to debate up and back, I'm very happy to have them after the class. We cannot afford to interrupt the class with those type of questions. I want to just share that I struggled a little bit with understanding what the two reasons over here are, and I see that even in Beryl Levin's elucidation to this tshuva, there seems to be two versions of his elucidation. One is the way it's published on his website, and one is the way it's published in his book. I just said the way it's published in his book. On his website, he says it a little bit different. He wants to say that the Magen Avraham would paskin like Rashi and the Rambam in this regard, and that's what Alter Rebbe means. Again, a little bit beyond the scope right now to get into that, into this detail, and I do acknowledge that this last 3 minutes might have been a little bit complicated for some people to follow. That's totally fine. You could jump back right back with us on our next line of the tshuva. The bottom line is, the Alter Rebbe is saying that we have to follow, that we cannot rely on Magen Avraham and Brei Chadash to be lenient, and therefore it's perfectly within Tavel of Bracha, it's perfectly legitimate halachically and praiseworthy for somebody to say, I'm going to follow the marashtam. So essentially what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that you remember this marashtam that you're not allowed to eat the yufka spread? Well, that same concern of the yufka spread applies to every matzah that we buy today because of the way it's processed so quickly and the ratio that there's a lot of flour to water, there might be some flour on the surface, and that is the reason why we have to be machmir on Gebrokts. Now, if you look, I gave out pictures of the manuscript. So if you look at the manuscript, on the bottom right of the picture, you'll see that there's two lines written perpendicular to the rest of the text. It's like a footnote almost, or a side note, which the copyist added in. I don't know if the copyist is adding this in his own interpretation, or he skipped a line in copying, and so he noticed afterwards that he skipped a line, and so he added it in as a note on the side. And that note says like this: "L'fi Magen Avraham, shegam hakemach shal gabei hamatz, the bekemach shal gabei hamatz." Lo chashinon shema lo nikla yafer lepri chadash mishum de bekemach ma'at lo chashinon. Right. So that is the way I explained the tshuva, the way I explained this argument that Alter Rebbe is making about the Pri Chadash and the Magen Avraham is according to this manuscript. That's the explanation he puts here on the side, and that's why I chose to explain it that way. Okay, so that's just you see the relevance of actually looking in the manuscript. I didn't actually notice this myself, but 11 points it out. But obviously went back to check the source, and it's always fun to see it in the actual manuscript. And now we're going to move on. After Magen Avraham Chodesh, even though the Magen Avraham and the Pri Chodesh are talking about actual literal flour that you add in other words, Magen Avraham is talking about a case where you went to add flour into your dough after you realized that there was too much water in your dough. The Pri Chodesh is talking about yufkas bread. Both of those are talking about where you actually add flour afterwards, whereas nowadays we're talking here about a regular, you didn't add any flour, you just made the dough and you made it into matzah. Mikol Malkim, nevertheless, we actually observe matzahs harbe, many matzahs. He doesn't say all the matzahs. He says we observe many matzahs. That even after you bake it, you can discern some flour on the surface after you bake it. You cannot deny that which you observe with your own eyes. Says the Alter Rebbe, why is it that none of the poskim mention this concern? And I'll ask you even further.
Right.
And some are bothered if this is a Chassidish minhag. Since when are we introducing new Chassidish minhagim in the school of the Maggid? I mean, the school of the Maggid is all based on the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov himself ate Gebrokts, apparently. So why are we coming up with something new? Says the Alter Rebbe, this problem is only prevalent in hard dough that has not been kneaded properly. In the early times, they would spend a lot of time on kneading and preparing the dough so that all the flour would be properly mixed into the dough. It's only in the past 20 years or so, or a little bit more, the holy Jewish people have become extra careful to make the kneading of the dough very fast, to make sure you bake it before it becomes chametz. And so this is a tremendous chumra. We're making sure to make the matzah so fast, but at the same time you're entering a new problem, that now you have a concern that maybe there's going to be some flour that's not mixed in properly, and therefore now is when we have this new concern that didn't exist prior to 20 years earlier, that this was that there's the flour on the surface which we have to be concerned about. Now, those Baruch Obelander and others who are very into the whole study of exactly tracing the different stages in the development of matzah, and the thin matzah, and the thick matzah, the soft matzah, the hard matzah, and the various iterations thereof, get very bogged down with this statement of what exactly changed 20 years before this tshuva was written. That doesn't really concern us right now, whether it was the recipe that changed or the speed in which they implemented the recipe that changed, or exactly what it is. The Alter Rebbe is just saying that something changed around then in the speed of creating the matzah, which left the problem of flour on the surface. This actually statement also gives us when the Alter Rebbe signs a tshuva, he writes Shnei Zalman ben Baruch, his father's name, and he writes Zechrein L'Chayim, which is something you would write after somebody has passed away. So we know that this tshuva was written after his father passed away, which is in the year Tov Kuf Nun Beis, which is about 20 years or so after the Maggid. The Maggid was nifter in Tav Kuf Lamed Beis. So that's so we don't know exactly when this tshuva was written, but it was written approximately 20 years or so after the Maggid was nifter, and that's what scholars use to date the tshuva and to sort of try and trace exactly all the steps in the process of in the development of making matzahs. Now, okay, so if our whole concern is that there's flour on the surface of the matzah, so maybe that's what we nowadays we have sophisticated science and labs to determine these things. Let's go and explore whether or not there's actually matzah on the surface. Now I'm going to make a disclaimer and say that I don't think
flour
on the surface. Now I'm going to make a disclaimer and say that Lamaisa at this stage it's a minhag which is very strongly pushed and acknowledged by the Alter Rebbe and so on. And so even if Eliyahu, Rapoport, or all the kings, if we can't find flour on the surface of the matzah, that's not going to mean that we should now decide to absolve this chumra, especially because Pesach, etc. We'll see in a minute. But nevertheless, I'll share with you the following. There is a contemporary Rav by the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah Katz, who's most famous for his expertise on building mikvahs. So, it matches the personality type. If you're building mikvahs, you're going to be very practical minded. So he decided to take matzahs to a lab and see if he could find flour on the surface of the matzah. And what he found was that it depends. He basically... there's different methods used in the matzah bakery. And some matzah bakeries use metal rolling pins of sorts to beat the dough, not to roll the dough, to beat the dough before the rolling stage, and some bakeries don't use that metal rod, and so what he found based on his lab checkings from various different matzahs in New York was that some bakeries that did not use the metal rod, they did in fact find flour on the surface, whereas you did not find any flour on the surface of matzah bakeries that did use the metal rod. Okay, anyway, that's the science of it. Do what you want with it. Let's move on. Okay, now we have to read the last line of the Alter Rebbe's Tshuva. So the Alter Rebbe is basically pushing that we do have to be machmir like the Maharshtam, just like the Maharshtam was machmir on Yufka spread. We have to apply that very same Maharshtam and chumra to our matzah because it's needed very quickly, and there could be some remnant flour on the surface, which we have to be concerned is not fully roasted and be machmir like Rabbi Yerucham, Rabbi Peretz, etc. Mikol Malkim finishes off the Alter Rebbe. I'm skipping a paragraph. Mikol Malkim says the Alter Rebbe in limchis b'hamoin am ha'mekilim. We should not be moicha. We do not have to reprimand or how do you say moicha? Don't have to.
Find fault or
Not find fault. We don't have to. Ari, help me out here. How do you say moicha in English? You don't have to, not reprimand, is it a better word?
Protest.
You don't have to protest, thank you. Those, hamoy na'am, those many people who are lenient about Gebrokts on Pesach, this is the part you came for, Kivin shel yesh lahem amashi yismoichu, you have what to rely on. V'ha'ikar al das Rashi v'Rambam, primarily he says relying on Rashi and the Rambam. At the end of the day, you could rely, there's the shit of the Rambam. It's interesting, because in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe doesn't even rely b'di'evad on the Rambam. He only relies on the Rambam b'di'evad as far as Balira Balimotz is concerned. That if b'di'evad you have roasted flour, you're allowed to have benefit, you don't have to sort of give it to a goy or destroy it. But he doesn't, the Alter Rebbe doesn't rely on the Rambam b'di'evad as far as eating is concerned. According to the Alter Rebbe, if you roasted flour, we would not allow you to eat it on Pesach, even b'di'evad. But here he's saying you could rely on the Avol, and here's the crux of it. The Arizal says you're supposed to be machmir all the chumras on Pesach. And I'll give you two quotes. One is a Mishnah's Chassidim recording the teachings of the Arizal, where it says, Hashoim Masechtas Nissen Perek Gimel Ois Dalet Hashoim Pesach Mechometz Kil Chosev Yachmir Boig B'Chol HaChumras Machmirim. Somebody who keeps chametz on Pesach properly and he does all the chumras that the Machmirim do, Yoyel Nafshei Ma'od Kol Hashana, this will help him neshama very much during the year. This is quoted by the Bayer Hativ, which is already much more classical halachic source on the page in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tov Mem Zayin, where he says, Arizal Kosta, the Arizal writes, Hanizim Mashu Chametz for Pesach, somebody who is careful even on a tiny speck of Mashu Chametz on Pesach, Muftach Lo Shelo Yechter Kol Hashana, is guaranteed not to sin the entire year. So the way the Bayer Hativ quotes it is a little bit different, and it raises some questions, because certainly by being Nisar Memashal Chametz, being careful of Chametz, it doesn't take away your free choice to do Averas. Obviously much has been said and discussed about this Bayer Hativ. The Rebbe spoke about it many times, many others spoke about this Bayer Hativ. That's not the point for right now, but the point is that the Arizal very much encourages going over the top when it comes to chumras on Pesach, and so certainly pshita, obviously sheyesh lahachmir, that we should be machmir karashtam should be brei chadash, like the Rashtam quoted by the brei chadash. Mikol makim, the Alter Rebbe finishes off b'yom tov achron amikol mishum sumchas yom tov lehisid, that if you're lenient on the last day of Pesach, that's okay. And in fact, and I mentioned last week that I think once upon a time it was difficult for people to survive the whole Pesach without knaidlech, and so we sort of gave it to them in Achron Pesach. Nowadays it's more like the Rebbe made it into sort of this almost ruchnistic ritual that after you've, as we all know, that after you've already gone through a whole week of Bir HaMiddos of Sriyas HaOmer, so now you can already sort of, you're a step closer to Shavuos, where you have the chametz, the shtei alechem is chametz, or chas v'shalom, we don't need chametz, but something which is a tiny bit of a chumra. Anyway, it's become more of a, it has more mystical meaning to it. Now, then the Alter Rebbe finishes off, and I'm going to spend, we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to spend a few minutes on this last few lines of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe finishes off, of a mei peiros, with fruit juice, with any liquid other than water. Pshita, it is obvious that ein hachmir klal kol Pesach, there is no reason to be machmir at all the entire Pesach. And so, if you want to have your matzah with avocado, for example, that is not Gebrokts, and there's no reason at all not to have it. Now, before you all stone me, those of you who have hung around Chabad families on Pesach may have noticed that many of them don't have matzah even with avocado on Pesach. So, what is up with that? So, I'm certainly not here to tell you not to have matzah with avocado on Pesach. Personally, I don't do it. That's how I grew up. That's just, we just don't do it, like many things on Pesach which don't make sense. But I'm certainly not here to tell anybody that they have to avoid it, or that they should tell their kids or anyone else to avoid it. But I'm just going to sort of present a few things which you see a little bit of history and one way or the other. So first of all, the Rebbe Rashab himself, the Rebbe Rashab himself, who we mentioned last week, was much more machmir than everybody else around his table when it came to Gebrokts. He would have something called shmura milk. In other words, they would make him milk. Remember the brei chadash spoke about making porridge from milk that you guarantee there's no water in it, and the brei chadash didn't like it, so with roasted flour. So that's what the Rebbe Rashab used for Gebrokts. That means the Rebbe Rashab would take shmura milk, they would provide milk for the Rebbe Rashab that was guaranteed to not have any water whatsoever mixed into it, and he would use the shmura milk for his Gebrokts. I'm actually remembering as I'm saying this that I meant to mention something.
I was eating Gebrokts. Did you say that they're...
One second. It's possible, I don't know.
The last day.
No, the whole Pesach, that's what he ate.
Why did he do that? It was
I guess it was, maybe, possibly, I don't know exactly. Yeah, I mean, we mentioned last week that he didn't have any fillings, so maybe it was just hard for him to chew the matzah, he had to soften it, I'm not sure. Now, in Oitzim and Hagei Chabad, Rabbi Munshen brings in the name of Ramotche Lechevich. Ramotche Lechevich is kind of also a Chassidish master, the ancestor of the Karlina dynasty. He kind of the same dates as the Alter Rebbe. His dates are 1742 to 1810, so kind of the same time period as Alter Rebbe. The same time period as Alter Rebbe. So over there it's brought that somebody asked him, can I have a milking cow? Can I milk into a dry utensil and use that to cook my matzah in the milk? And he said, and the Lechevich answered him that with something that our holy rabbis were machmir, don't start looking for kulas for leniencies. Now, so what exactly does this mean? If we're to trust the style, the way this teaching is recorded, like it was kind of him saying, like, stop, like just be accepting of this chumra. It seems like it wasn't so much the milk itself that bothered him, as much as the attitude that you couldn't just accept that we have to avoid certain things, and he didn't like the obsession with trying to find a way to make it work. Perhaps that's it. I don't know. There is also a difference that the Rebbe Rashab wasn't cooking his matzah in the milk; he was just dipping it in the milk, whereas cooking. Possibly this is far to say it's worse. I'll get to that in a moment. Although, like we already mentioned before, from the Hagoy Smak of Rabbeinu Peretz, so you see that already Rabbeinu Peretz was concerned that you couldn't guarantee that the milk would actually be 100% water-free. Although, if you want to really get technical, I think it's much easier to determine that avocado would be water-free than milk. Because milk, there's a whole process. Certainly nowadays, milk absolutely has water mixed into it. But avocado, you take a clean, dry knife, you cut it up, and there's no reason at all to concern. Anyway, now there is in Gedalia Oberlander's article on Gebrokts. He brings from a sefer called Sameh Dechaya. I don't know anything about the author of the sefer. The only thing I know about the sefer is that it was printed in Baditchev in the year Tov Reish Nun Vav. That's 1896. And in that sefer, he has a whole pilpul based on a Pri Megadim that there is a concern when you cook matzah meal that when you cook matzah meal, that the water within the matzah becomes reawakened, and so now if you're going to mix it with fruit juice, so you have not just fruit juice with flour, but fruit juice mixed with water and flour, so that would be a problem of creating chametz, and therefore in this sefer Sameh Dechaya, he says that you're not even allowed to have matzah brei. He says that matzah brei, which is just eggs, would also be gebrokts. Now again, that would not apply to avocado, where you're not cooking the matzah, you're just smearing the avocado on the raw matzah. Now, then there is another important source if you're talking about mei peres, in the sefer called Kisvei Rabbi Yoshe Shoiv, Rabbi Yoshe Shoiv, where he brings a very drastic story of the Sephardi daughter-in-law of one of the great Hasidic masters. I forgot to copy exactly who it was, where he says that basically his daughter-in-law couldn't cope with this hard matzah in her father-in-law's house, and she asked if she could cook it in eggs, which is not even gebrokts, like we said. It's matzah brei, basically, it seems she wanted, and he only allowed her to do it in the neighbor's house, not in his house. So that would seem to be some source to be machmer even on mei peres, even on other liquid, at least if it's cooked. I don't know about raw. However, I should point out that, as Rabbi Munchen points out in his footnotes to his book Maaseh Baditchev, that many items in this book, Kisvei Rabbi Yoshe Shoiv, are highly questionable, and it's very difficult to take anything it says in this sefer at face value, and so the reliability of this story is in question. Finally, Rabbi Gedalia Oberlander also brings, interestingly, that the Stipler, that's the father of Chaim Kanievsky, so certainly not a chassid, but apparently he was so machmar gebrokts, he even didn't allow gebrokts in mei peres and in fruit juices, which kind of matches his personality of being machmar in everything. I still have another couple, if you will bear with me for another minute or two. I forgot to mention earlier something which I found very interesting when I mentioned the when I mentioned the Hagoy Smak, that he did not allow to make gebrokts. He did not allow to make the porridge with roasted flour, even if you do chaluta beroischin, even if you make sure the water is boiling before and you just throw it into directly boiling water. So I saw that Rabbi Munchen brings in Eitzim and Hagi Chabad that in the house of the Tzemach Tzedek they would do gebrokts like this. In other words, they would. I'm trying to find it in my notes over here. Just a moment. Hold on.
The one.
Hold on. Okay, I must have somehow deleted this from my notes, but if I recall correctly, I saw this explicitly in Eitzim and Hagi Chabad, that in the home of the Tzemach Tzedek they would use gebrokts by making something chaluta beroitzkin. In other words, they would use gebrokts, but they would just make sure to put it only directly into boiling hot water. But already in the time of his son, of the Maharash, that was completely ruled out. Now, finally, I want to say like this: the Alter Rebbe finishes off with saying that the reason that the part of the basis to be machmer like the Rashtam is because of the arizal of being machmer all the chumras on Pesach, and I think that it's reasonable to suggest that, and again, Rabbi Homnik certainly inspired these thoughts, that the Alter Rebbe is going here with this with the approach of like, why is this so important? Incorporating the Torah, the teachings of the Arizal in our observance in general and in Pesach specifically, and that is, it's not just about being machmer all the chumras, but it's also understanding, according to the teachings of the Arizal, what does chametz represent? Chametz represents evil. Chametz represents ego. Chametz represents all the things which we're trying to avoid. And like the Rambam, actually, if you want to bring rationalist aspect into here, the Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim that we refrain from eating chametz for a whole week because that's how much long it takes to imbibe the message of avoiding chametz. And the Rambam's message is a little bit different, what chametz represents. But also here, if we go the whole week of Pesach, being so extremely machmir, even for very far-fetched things, to not just to actually make sure there's no crumb of matzah in your soup, but also to imbibe the message that the tiniest iota of selfishness, of ego, of ra, of taiva, of all the things that chametz represents, to be avoided. So that's also part of the message of the Alter Rebbe here, that this is not just a technical halachic stuff, but that Chassidim live Pesach under with the influence and the spirit of the Arizal's teachings, which is trying to remember, and I think that is a takeaway for myself personally, that there's always the balance between making sure your table on Pesach, everything's okay, and there's no chas v'shalom, any crumbs going into the soup, and also you don't want to, you want to make sure you're talking to your family and to your children nicely, and certainly to your guests, and there's often this question of the balance, and how crazy and extreme do you be on the cheshbon of what, but I think that there's also a point to be made, that also to try and take the time and space to think about why we're doing all of this, and what does chametz represent, and how do we avoid the real chametz in our Avodas Hashem, like the Arizal says, throughout the whole year.